When it comes to fantasy storytelling, there are really three creatures in mind that are your bread and butter. Three fantasy species that really solidify your story as well. Fantasy. And that, for me at least, is elves, trolls or goblins, and dragons. As you may or probably don't know, I am a big fantasy kind of guy. Fantasy is my favorite genre of game, movie, book, music. Well, okay, maybe the music one doesn't make any sense, but I think you get what I'm trying to say. So I love this little series that I've started where we take a look at all the different types and versions of a certain creature in fantasy and folklore. And today has come the time to talk about dragons. That's right. Or at least most types of dragons in fantasy, folklore, their origins, and the implementation of these massive, terrifying, sometimes overpowered creatures that are so often a key component in a classic fantasy story. We've done elves, we've done trolls, and now let's dive into dragons, which promises to be probably a bit more complicated than the other two because there is a lot to cover here. And the main question is, of course, who did it best? Which author, which game, which movie did dragons best? But quickly before that, make sure to subscribe. This is only the third video in the series exploring fantasy creatures in various different shows and films and books and games. So if you want to see more, if you wouldn't just mind helping out the channel, in a new way, because it's a new channel, it would very much help. Make sure to subscribe for more content like this and to support me. But with that out of the way, let's get into it. So let's start with dragons in fantasy stories, some of the most famous that we know, before moving on to dragons in folklore, their different appearances and representations in folklore, and their origin, etc. There are timestamps on the video, by the way, as well, if you want to skip ahead to that though. But without any further ado, let's get straight into it and start with your most classic, normal type of dragon that most likely comes to your mind when thinking of these massive, regal, and often frightening creatures, and that is the winged, scaly, fire-breathing dragons that have become so popular in fantasy media. The most obvious examples of these would be in Game of Thrones, Harry Potter, the Elder Scrolls series, Eragon, and Smaug in J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit, D&D dragons, and Warhammer more. All great examples of the type of dragon that most likely comes to your mind when I mention the gargantuan creatures. You know how I said that dragons, trolls, and elves are the bread and butter of a fantasy story? Well, if you then want the bread and butter of fantasy dragons, that accolade has to go to these reptilian, winged, fire breathing creatures that range from terrifying to gracious and stunning to look at. And that is one thing that I find particularly interesting with dragons in really all fantasy media. Because if you take a look at all of fantasy media and looked at dragons in every single one of these works, it would actually be so hard to determine whether the creatures are good or bad. It's true in all the different fantasy media, even the most popular ones, dragons are portrayed so differently in each one. And I don't necessarily mean in appearance, I mean in how good or evil they are, whether they are a force for good in the world the story is set in, or creatures of evil that are blatantly against the main protagonists. And yes, like I said, they're depicted in so many different ways in fantasy pieces. Some are good, some are bad, some are somewhere in the middle. One of the best examples of this, though, would of course be The Elder Scrolls, almost specifically because it's really the only game in the series I played, Skyrim. Because that is the game I know most about as well, so it's probably best to just stick to that. So yes, Skyrim is an interesting one because the main character is literally called the Dragonborn, or Dovahkiin, an extremely powerful man whose main deal, the thing that he does, is that he can absorb the souls, of dragons. That's right, that is what the Dragonborn does. He absorbs the soul of dragons. And that is basically the main objective of Skyrim. What you're supposed to do is to absorb as many souls as possible till they become really, really powerful. And even at the start of the Skyrim game, the main character, his objective is to escape the dragon right at the beginning, and then through the game you fight many other dragons. Yet not all are evil. And probably the best and maybe only example of this in the game is Paarthurnax, an extremely wise and powerful dragon, leader of the Greybeards, who also helps the Dovahkiin in his quest. And then you kill him at the end anyways, so I don't know if, yeah. So it varies. What I'm trying to say is that it varies, there are no doubt about it. Some are good, some dragons are bad, and there's some in a grey area. In both Skyrim and in other pieces of fantasy media, of course, there's a mix. And another great example of this would be How to Train Your Dragon, another book series, then movie franchise that centers around dragons. And in How to Train Your Dragon, you have, of course, the good dragons like Toothless, but then you have the evil ones that aren't so good, like Red Death, most infamously. And then similarly in Harry Potter, whilst the dragons might seem evil on the surface, in reality they're just beasts that have been cruelly treated by wizards and really don't do anything particularly evil in the entirety of the story. You have some that are portrayed as bad, like the one that Harry fights in the Triwizard Tournament, or rather the one that he has to escape. And then you have it in the Deathly Hallows, where they escape on a dragon. It just varies, but dragon creatures in Harry Potter are very different. It's more that they're slaves and are cruelly treated more than actually having their own will. So all in all, it's quite hard to come up with a proper answer as to whether dragons are chiefly good or evil in fantasy media. But one thing for sure, and that is that it is quite a mixed bag. Which is fun, of course. It's a lot of fun having a story where there are massive, flying, often overpowered creatures, but they can be evil and a source of fear and death. But also, there could be good. There are good ones among them, which makes for an interesting contrast and definitely makes them overall a much more interesting species. Moving away from that, then, to look at another type of dragon who we haven't really talked about yet in fantasy, and that is, of course, one of the most famous, Tolkien's dragons. Because, as we all know, if you want a famous fantasy creature that has inspired so many authors to date, you go to J.R.R. Tolkien, the man himself, and in this case, to The Hobbit, for Smaug. Now, Smaug in particular is such an intriguing character because he, of course, has ties back to old folklore, which we'll be talking about soon, and he's similar to so many of other Tolkien's creation in that way. His Tolkien's elves, Tolkien's trolls all carry some links back to old mythology, whether that be Norse, most of the time is, or Greek, Icelandic, Germanic, or something different. And for Smaug the dragon, well, it's mainly, of course, Norse mythology, as with a lot of other of Tolkien's creatures. Because you see, in the medieval Norse sagas, the dragon Fafnir was originally a dwarf who murdered his father to steal his gold and somehow changed shape into a dragon to guard the treasure. Sound familiar? Well, that's because it probably is, since Smaug himself was a covetous old dragon who hoarded his wealth that he stole like the dwarf, and then protected it for decades and decades before being killed. Pretty similar. And yeah, and one particular theme with Tolkien's dragons is that they are very, very evil, at least the one that we know, yet highly intelligent creatures, which then also carry some links back to old Christian folklore in turn, which is pretty understandable since it's, of course, quite not common knowledge that Tolkien's works contained a lot of Catholic meanings and messages. And the particular piece of Christian folklore I'm talking about is, of course, you probably have heard of it, the Brother Grimm story of the dragon and his grandmother, Satan, in the guise of a dragon. And this story is a bit less known, but of course, you'll probably know the Brothers Grimm. So, Satan, in the guise of a dragon, tempts three soldiers with gifts in exchange for the chance to win their souls if they cannot answer his riddle. Once again, here dragons are predicted as, highly intelligent but evil creatures, something that may or may not have been a direct influence for Smaug, but it's clear to see the similarities, of course, with the riddle. And one other fantasy piece of media that follows that trend is The Witcher, because in The Witcher, dragons are also drawn to hoarding gold. In conclusion, though, before moving on to talk about, the folklore and origins of dragons, including their ties to fantasy, let's just take one last look at dragons in fantasy and who did it best. So, in shows like Game of Thrones, The Dragon Prince, How to Train Your Dragon, and more, or literature like Eragon, Shadow of the Gods by John Gwynne, is probably lesser known than a lot of the stuff I mentioned in this video, but I highly recommend checking out Shadow of the Gods. It is a great book and a great series. Back to it, The Hobbit, games like D&D, The Elder Scrolls, Warhammer especially, where they have a very, very cool lore to dragons and others. There is a mix of good and bad dragons, monster beings of great power. Put the real thing that makes these creatures interesting, that is the main thing that we need to talk about because it's the way that they use that power. Do they use it to help the world, rid it of evil forces, or are they only worried for themselves, for money, and are often portrayed as beings of fear and malice and evil? That is one of the biggest issues or conflicts that fantasy writers or filmmakers or game designers probably face. And I think that for the most part is quite well executed, whether the dragons in your story are good, bad, or different. And the question is, of course, for this video, who did it best? Well, this time around, I'm not going to actually go with Tolkien and the Lord of the Rings because if you've seen the other two videos in this series thus far, you'll know that I am usually inclined to go with Tolkien's creatures as being the best around, mainly due to their shaping of the future of those species, due to the everlasting iconicness of them and the future with all these new authors and filmmakers really basing their creatures off Tolkien's. But for this one, I'm going to have to go different, and I have to go with the novel Eragon as containing the best written dragons in fantasy. And I haven't talked much about Eragon in this video so far because I wanted to discuss it here. So Eragon as a novel and the inheritance cycle as a whole isn't exactly my favorite book series of all time. I wouldn't say that at all. It's good, but it is without a doubt not the best that has ever turned around. But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the dragons in it. Because if I'm being honest, it still ranks so highly for me in terms of the way dragons are written and presented because of, well, exactly that, the way that they're written and presented, the way that Christopher Paolini wrote and portrayed dragons. Eragon was one of the first books I ever read as a kid where the dragons weren't these brutish, horrible, fear-inducing characters with no intelligence, but rather sentient beings who feel emotion, who have the capability to befriend humans. And then that way, in the end, dragons are accepted by humans, which is great. So yeah, Eragon does have to take the crown for me, but overall, dragons are just really very well written in most fantasy, anyways. And also, if you want to give your recommendations for where fantasy dragons were done best, absolutely do it. There's so many dragon novels out there. I have not read all of them, so there's probably so many better examples. But make sure to tell me in the comments if I haven't mentioned yours. But now, let's move on to dragons in mythology and folklore. So it's honestly hard to pin down the origin of dragons to one particular culture because, simply put, draconian is probably the correct word, creatures appear in virtually all cultures around the globe. But the origins of dragons in folklore can be traced back, in my opinion at least, to ancient mythologies in the Near East, Greece, and Mesopotamia mainly. Stories about storm gods slaying giant serpents occur throughout nearly all Near Eastern and Indo European mythologies, which I found particularly interesting to myself, because we do see with other creatures such as elves and trolls that across time, regions, and cultures, the ideas and perception of these fantastical races and species somewhat differ. Some cultures, like I mentioned with how it's done in books, have positive views of them as creatures that help others or are hidden, benevolent things they prefer to stay away from others. But then, similar to media, other cultures depict these species as evil, a threat, and usually inferior to humanity. But for the most part, elves, of course, themselves are considered as good, pure creatures that are definitely viewed positively. And then for the most part, trolls, which was our last video, are viewed negatively as horrible, unpleasant creatures. But then, with dragons, the views on different cultures on them is so hard to pin down, to really give an answer to as to whether they're perceived as bad for the most part or good in folklore and in fantasy as well, which we talked about before. Because you may think that, of course, it would be the dragons are considered as mainly bad throughout cultures and history because that's the main thing. Of course, there might be some examples of them being good, but when you actually read up on it, there's so many examples of dragons being considered as benevolent creatures, really intelligent ones that are better than humanity. So it definitely does differ where you look, which I do find really fun though. And then, for example, I'll give you one example. In Celtic mythology, they are both good and evil. Yeah, sometimes treated like gods of wisdom, etc., but then also feared. But that is just one example. There are so many more because this has fluctuated considerably throughout regions and societies. And there is one very helpful source as to how dragons have also become more positively viewed now, especially in dragon based games and books. There's definitely more positive views than it would have been maybe in the past. Because in some games, movies, etc., dragons can be the good guys, helpful to our main characters just as often as they can be the bad ones. And that source that I would like to refer to as being maybe an influence, of course, maybe it might not be, but this is one that I definitely interpreted as probably having an influence. And that source is the 1898 short story by British writer Kenneth Graham, his most famous short story, and it is almost a prototype to modern stories in which the dragon is a sympathetic character rather than a threat. And by the way, if you're wondering what the book was called, because I forgot to tell you, it was called The Reluctant Dragon. And yeah, it's more of a sympathetic creature, which of course could have had an influence. And then, of course, we have the different types of dragons, such as the ones who love to hoard and keep money, a tale that I mentioned before with the medieval Norse tale of a dwarf who became a dragon to guard his gold. Perhaps one of the oldest pieces of folklore regarding this, though, is that of ancient Mesopotamia, a civilization existing around 6000 to 1500 BC. And in Mesopotamian legend, the evil goddess Tiamat is sometimes represented as a dragon and is said to have given birth to dragons as well as other monsters. So it's obvious that since pretty much the beginning of dragons in folklore, they have, been portrayed as evil beings at some point, and really only recently, I would say more recently, do we see them becoming more sympathetic creatures, which isn't a nice twist in a way. But even then, there's still so many ancient civilizations which would have viewed dragons as positive, as creatures of greatness. Now, I just want to do something quickly because I want to read a portion of an essay I found on Quora when researching for this video about dragons and their origins. It's also pretty common for traditional Western literature to represent dragons as dumb animals, dangerous but not really capable of good or evil. The dragon Python of Greek mythology, the dragon of St. George, Beowulf's dragon, and the dragon from the story of Bel in the Book of Daniel are all represented as wild beasts, sometimes greedy or tameable but not able to speak or plan like people. As they did with many other aspects of nature, both animate, animate and inanimate, ancient Western peoples often appeased dragons with offerings, which may be where dragons got their reputation as treasure hoarders. In sharp contrast, Chinese dragons are traditionally shown as essentially benevolent creatures identified with rivers that water the soil and give strength to the nation. They are also shown as gods or servants of gods, which is probably best known in movies like Mulan. And one final segment before ending off this video: dragons, as you probably know, are very similar to other creatures, several others in fact, in fantasy. Similar to trolls with goblins and ogres, for dragons you have basilisks, nagas, hydras, sea serpents, and many more creatures that can be linked to the species we're discussing today, often even replacing them in certain stories. But anyways, that is all for today. Make sure to comment down below any other additional information you'd like to share and your opinion on the best representation of dragons in fantasy, whether you agree with my take or not. And make sure to subscribe as I continue if you want me to continue this series, make sure to tell me in the comments, of course. And if you want to see similar videos, make sure to subscribe. It'd be a huge, huge help. But that's all for today. Thanks for watching. Darth Sauron.